Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, and thank you for joining us. Tonight on All In, NSA surveillance is the big story, but I've still got my eyes on you, Marco Rubio. You don't get to pretend to be the hero of immigration reform while working behind the scenes to kill it. I'll tell you about his latest backdoor shenanigans coming up, plus some surprising good news from the violence-plagued city of Chicago. But is the news too good to be true? And I know the Tonys were this week, but the truly star-studded affair, the one with Hugh Jackman and Tom Cruise live on stage together, that was at a Walmart shareholder meeting in Arkansas. And yeah, it's just about the weirdest thing ever. Seriously, you have to see this tape. But we begin tonight with this man, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, who 50 years ago today made his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door, a principled stand on behalf of evil. In defiance of the United States Justice Department, Governor George Wallace stood outside the University of Alabama, personally blocking 2 black students from enrolling there.
I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to willingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government.
Today, 50 years later, when we look back on that moment, on June 11th, 1963, we can tell very clearly the heroes from the villains. George Wallace was obviously the villain in this story, and Vivian Malone and James Hood, the 2 students who were blocked by George Wallace from registering that day, were heroes. Along with the rest of the civil rights movement, folks like Martin Luther King Jr., the people who were fighting for integration, they're the heroes, they're the good guys. But to the United States government at the time, it was not at all clear. In 1963, President Kennedy himself said this of Dr. King.
The trouble with King is everybody thinks he's our boy, and this King is so hot these days. It's like Mark's coming to the White House.
Like Mark's coming to the White House. JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, admitted later that he asked the FBI to make an intensive investigation of Martin Luther King, and that on October 10th, 1963, he personally authorized the FBI to begin wiretapping King's phones. The Kennedys were most certainly not alone in these attitudes towards Dr. King. In the 1960s, much of the security apparatus of the Cold War American state was obsessed with the idea that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists, infiltrated by subversives, and working to tear down U.S. society from the inside. And no single person captured the fear and paranoia of the security apparatus more than Dr. Martin Luther King. So, faced with what they perceived as a threat, the security state did what all security states do when faced with a perceived threat. They surveilled Dr. King around the clock. They stalked his every move. They broke into and bugged his office. They bugged his hotel rooms, and they were tapped into his phones. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover in particular, were so maniacally obsessed with ruining Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that in 1964, just after Hoover called King the most notorious liar in the country in a press conference, a package was sent to King in the mail. A package that the House Select Committee ultimately traced back to the FBI. Inside this package, one of the most remarkable artifacts in American history was an anonymous letter addressed to Martin Luther King and a copy of an electronic surveillance tape, apparently to lend credence to threats of exposure of derogatory personal information made in the letter. We don't know to this day for sure what was on that tape. The heavy speculation throughout the years was that it was of personal and sexual nature, recorded by a device planted in Dr. King's hotel room. The letter that came with the tape read in part, quote, "You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. The American public will know you for what you are, an evil, abnormal beast. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." The House Select Committee considered it highly likely that Director Hoover had before-the-fact knowledge of the action. So, that's a letter encouraging Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to kill himself, sent to King from the FBI. This happened in American history. It's just one example out of many of how the full weight of the surveillance state constructed to fight the Cold War was used against the people working for racial equality. It may have been constructed to defeat the Russians and the genuine threat of global communism, but it was deployed on people like Stokely Carmichael and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is all particularly relevant today, not just because it's generally good to take heed of the lessons from history, but because of the spy novel-esque mystery that is unfolding in the news right now. which involves the uncovering of a massive and sophisticated surveillance apparatus being operated by the United States government. The whereabouts of the 29-year-old at the center of the intrigue, intelligence contractor Edward Snowden, have been unknown since he checked out of a Hong Kong hotel after filming a jaw-dropping interview in which he took credit for leaking classified documents exposing government phone and internet spying tactics and programs. Since his video confession, he has officially been fired. The consulting firm Booz Allen announcing the firing today, saying he'd worked there for less than 3 months and earned a salary of $122,000 a year as a systems administrator on contract to the NSA. Notably, is quite a bit less than the $200,000 he claimed to have been making. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is reportedly already working on pursuing criminal charges against Snowden, which is said to be the first step necessary to force him to return to the U.S. And the ACLU filed a lawsuit against the Obama administration today, charging that the newly exposed phone record collection being done by the government is illegal. The ACLU is asking a judge to bar the mass collection of domestic phone logs and to order existing records to be purged, arguing the program, quote, gives the government a comprehensive record of our associations and public movements, revealing a wealth of detail about our familial, political, professional, religious, and intimate associations. But all of that said, when you look at public opinion, Americans appear, at the moment at least, and you may be watching this feel this way, to be fairly tolerant of this kind of surveillance. When you ask, as pollsters from the Washington Post and Pew did this week, if it's more important for the government to investigate terror threats or to preserve Americans' privacy, an overwhelming majority, 62%, say investigate threats even if it violates our privacy. And those numbers are, well, I think totally understandable. Because everybody wants the government to catch terrorists. And the loss of privacy seems fairly abstract. And most Americans probably feel pretty far removed from the days of J. Edgar Hoover spying on Dr. Martin Luther King, and with some good reason. I mean, if you ask me, in the abstract, do you think it's okay for the government to be able to access millions of Americans' phone records and internet activity as long as those tools are just for catching terrorists and they're never, ever abused? I would be tempted to say yes, that's totally okay. But there's a pretty major sticking point, and that is the as long as it's not abused part. Because history tells us that is not actually a thing, a non-abused massive government surveillance apparatus. That is not what Dr. Martin Luther King tells us. Frankly, you don't even have to look at history. Just look at the news from the fall of 2008, when a pair of NSA whistleblowers came forward to talk about what was being done with the agency's surveillance tools way back then.
I would say that after 9/11, particularly with the fact that we were listening to satellite phone communications, rather than targeting military entities in the Middle East, we were actually listening to a lot of everyday, ordinary people who really, in many ways, had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism.
At times when I was told, hey, check this out, there's something real, there's some good phone sex, or there's some pillow talk, pull up this call, it's really funny, you'd go check it out, and it'd be some colonel making pillow talk.
And you would listen?
It was there, stored the way you look at songs on your iPod. And
that was our post-9/11 anti-terror surveillance state at work just a few years ago. But examples of big, sweeping surveillance programs misfiring are all over the place. Just last month, NBC's Michael Isikoff flagged reports that a special Homeland Security-funded Boston intelligence unit was closely monitoring anti-Wall Street demonstrations, including tracking the Facebook pages and websites of the protesters and writing reports on the potential impact on commercial and financial sector assets in downtown areas, right around the time the U.S. government received the second of two warnings from the Russian government about the radical Islamic ties of alleged Boston marathoner Tamerlan Tsarnaev. When you construct a massive surveillance apparatus, history tells us that it will be brought to bear not just on, quote, the enemy, but on the people who threaten society's power structure, on whoever exists at the political margins, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or some Occupy Boston protesters. It's not some Orwellian abstraction. It's America's history and America's recent history. And left unchecked, I fear, America's future. Joining me now is civil rights activist Julian Bond. He's former chairman of the NAACP, a founding member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Mr. Bond, it's a great honor to have you. And I just want to start with getting your reaction as someone who lived through this period, who lived with the knowledge that the government was tracking you and tracking colleagues and associates of yours, how you are understanding the last few days of revelations and news.
Well, it's all over again. Andy Young, Dr. King's lieutenant, used to say we all live in a recording studio and the engineer is J. Edgar Hoover. I got a copy of my FBI files, and I wondered, why did this agency spend all of this time writing down my car tag numbers, saying I'd been to this place, I'd been to that place, I'd been to this place, none of them illegal, none of them with any kind of criminal intent, when they could have been catching real criminals. Why'd they do that? Why did the State Sovereignty Commission in Mississippi spend 20 years following and surveilling white and black figures in the freedom movement in Mississippi? Only because they were opposed to white supremacy. Governments do these kinds of things, and once they do them, they can't control them. They want to listen to the salacious telephone call. They want to take the picture they shouldn't take of people doing whatever they're doing. They just have to do it. Sadly, government cannot control itself with this tool at hand.
And it's very interesting to hear you say that, because the argument we've been hearing over the last few days is, look, J. Edgar Hoover was he was an anomalous figure in American history, and he was a rogue agent of state power. And what we have right now is we have all three branches of government. We have Congress that's been briefed on these programs. We have FISA courts that have signed off on this, and we have the executive and oversight. And so this is something very different. This is apples and oranges when I sit here and make these comparisons to the 1960s. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's all well and good to say that and to believe that, and we hope that's the truth, that good people are in charge now. Those were bad people way back then. But do you know about the fusion centers? Mm-hmm. There are 72 fusion centers around the United States controlled by police agencies. What are they doing? Who are they listening to? What do we know about them? This is frightful to me, to know that in 17 locations around the United States, the agents of government are listening to my telephone, or doing this, or doing that, following me in some way or the other. Not me particularly, but people like me. It's scary for me.
When people, there's been some polling to suggest that Democrats have had quite a change of heart on this issue, and I think part of that is just the natural way that trust works in a political system. People are inclined to trust Barack Obama if they're Democrats for all sorts of reasons. They feel their worldviews align. What do you have to say to folks that find themselves conflicted by the news this week, but have a tendency to trust someone like Barack Obama, who they feel is a good person with a good vision, and they voted for and they support?
I'm conflicted, too. I have a lot of trust. I want to trust, but I've seen this happen before. I've seen us go down this road before, and I'm afraid we may well go down this road right now. I don't see anybody stopping it or telling me that we're not doing it. Just telling me to trust people is not enough for me.
Civil rights activist legend, in fact, Julian Bond. It's a great honor to have you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.